Welcome to Beyond the Qubit. Today we have a special guest, Henny Crauwels. Henny will interview me about my learnings about the interview of Parity Computing. And this is a new format and I'm quite excited. So thank you, Henny. Thank you for being here and for willing to interview me. And maybe one more thing, Henny, a little bit about Henny. Henny has 30 years capital market experience and he's an expert in TMT, telecom, media and technology. And with that, I give the floor to Henny.
Well, it's my pleasure, Frank. Happy to interview you and try to learn something in between also. You just did a deep dive with ParityQC. I wonder, as an investor, what would for me be the most important thing that you have learned?
Now, before we start, I want to make two disclaimers. This is not investment research. That's the first one. And the second one is, I do this podcast under my own name and I do not represent any company. Now, having that out of the way, what were my biggest takeaways and my biggest lessons learned? When I started my journey in quantum technology, I was really thinking about how much can the physical qubits grow? And that transformed to, okay, how much can the logical qubits grow? But I never thought about how can you organize the information? Can you organize the information in a smarter way? And that is what ParityQC is trying to achieve. And they do that with software and an architecture. They organize the information differently. Maybe this is a little bit complex, but what excites me is that this architecture enables to get more out of the hardware. And not only that, it's also this approach is possible for multiple quantum technologies. So it's not only applicable to one.
Does that imply that you are going to look more at the software side of quantum technology, or is still the hardware which is where it actually happens? And is ParityQC, is this really something totally new for you? If it gives it totally new insights to you?
Yes, before I wasn't aware of this company because I've never researched into them. And I will not. I will look at the total landscape, including hardware, sensors, quantum sensors, and hardware. And I still believe that what I found interesting is the early monetization phases that have exposure to the multiple technologies. Because at the moment it's undecided which quantum technology will win. So I really like the enabling technologies. And I want to learn more about that. And I want to understand the impact on the total value chain. But does it answer your question, Henny?
Yes, it answers my question in a way. Perhaps the next question for me is, I don't know the company. I just got introduced to it by you. Could you explain very easily what they are exactly doing or trying to do?
Yes, what they try to do is they try to organize the information differently. So normally, information in quantum technology is you have bits that are being transformed into qubits. And qubits, if you have two pairs of qubits, you need to link them together. But with superconducting qubits, for example, you cannot connect far away qubits. So if you think about, we cover the telecom operators. And if you have fiber connections, if you have a few houses next to each other, let's say you have qubit A and B, they're next to each other, so that you can directly connect them. But if the qubit is far away, you cannot directly connect them. And then you need to move to multiple gates that's called swap gates, to connect them. And every time you go through a faraway qubit, you create some noise, and some that could create potential errors. And what I find interesting is about the approach of ParityQC is that the architecture is totally different. So instead of looking at the absolute information, so the co-founder Wolfgang, how he described it is, instead of if you have a map and you have 3 cities in Europe, Amsterdam, London, and Vienna, instead of describing where on the map Amsterdam lies, you could also look at the relative distances. So what is the relative distance between Amsterdam and Vienna? What is the relative distance between Amsterdam and London? And that is a different way of organizing the information, and that lends itself better to, in that way, you have a few benefits: better connectivity, simplified programmability, and a natural link into error correction. And it's a more efficient way for certain algorithms, including the quantum Fourier transform.
And is this making today's quantum computers better, or is it more for the future?
It's making today's quantum computers better. However, I have to explain it a little bit. In the press release, they said, okay, we have 52 qubits. So they used IBM's hardware, and IBM is using a superconducting technology. They used IBM Heron, and they were able to demonstrate that they could use 52 qubits. And can you use that really to do useful and meaningful things? No. I think for me, if you really wanted to have an error-corrected, fault-tolerant, error-corrected quantum computer, you need approximately 1,000 to 2,000 logical qubits. That's not what they demonstrated here. But what they demonstrated is that they used on the benchmark, the quantum Fourier transform. They showed that they could get the maximum out more than what IBM standalone could get out of it. So
basically, yes.
So
it's a kind of symbiotic. Sorry.
It's not that it's already that now you can do meaningful stuff with it, but it's a significant step towards an improved outcome.
So they are helping the hardware producers to get better results. That's what they are doing.
Yes, exactly. And maybe there are maybe 3 things. So you have the physical qubits, you have algorithm qubits, and you have fault-tolerant logical qubits. Parity does not help with physical qubits. That's the hardware provider who creates them. That is IBM, Google, QEra. That's not what Parity does. But given they look at the relationships and the distances between the cities, the relative distances, they can use algorithms more efficient. Physical qubits you used to run on a circuit for a benchmark, and Parity's result is really in category 2, algorithmic qubits, and not in logical qubits.
Okay, I read some of the stuff you sent me about this, and you described them as potentially trying to become the arm of quantum. What do you mean by that? Is that
what I really liked is that if they enable hardware providers to get more out of the hardware, and if they're a neutral host, they can charge a royalty. And I think the hardware that they have is meaningful, and it will help to bring quantum computers towards more useful and better output than what there is today. And I think they can charge for that. And the proof point of that is that they in 2023 they were already profitable. And I think in the press release they stated, okay, we have the world record on the quantum Fourier transform benchmark, and they demonstrated on real hardware and on a real algorithm. So, and the combination of both, I think, will help them in their adoption of the technology.
If I understand well, you see them as being quite a kind of a neutral actor between different players in the industry. And why would that be attractive to be open for all players?
Now, for some players it might not be attractive. So if you're why it is attractive, I think it's for parity it's very attractive. But for others who are not using them, it might be an issue. So maybe somebody will try to get control of them. Because if you have control and the competitors don't have the control, then you might have a natural advantage.
So what does parity tell you about where the value may be captured in quantum? Is that on the software side, on the hardware side, on the combination?
Now, I think parity is a little bit in between the hardware and the software. So for me, during the interview, I learned there was a new part in the value chain, which is the architecture side. And that is the relative distances that Wolfgang describes on the map. The relative distance between Amsterdam and Vienna. And with their approach, they're able to get more out of the current hardware. And I think if they create value, they can charge the customers for that. And I think this is what I really like, is that it is a bit technology agnostic approach. So I think the first value will come maybe from the architecture way, and then the hardware side, and then in a later stage potentially the software side.
Mm-hmm. And so why could, well, you are referring more or less to an architectural licensing model, and why could that be attractive?
Now the attractive part is that first of all, licensing models tend to be very high margin models, and there is lower or less technology risk involved, because the technology can be applied to multiple quantum technologies. So the technology risk is lower, and you don't have to bet on one single company or one single technology. And that speaks, I'm quite attracted to that.
Mm-hmm. So if I understand you well, there is less risk in this kind of companies because they are not betting on one technology, but they are every possible technology being used for
they bet on one
quantum.
They bet on one technology, they bet on their own technology, but yes, they support multiple quantum technologies. Yes, that's cool.
Okay, that's clear. And is that also what makes this business model interesting for an investor?
Yes, I think so. I think this makes it very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, perhaps that's also validated by them saying that they have been profitable already for a few years, and this seems to be unusual in quantum. Could you explain a bit more about that?
Yes, at the moment it requires a lot of the hardware providers. If you have to build a quantum computing, the difficulty is that it costs a lot of money to build a quantum computer. Think about the talent that you need to hire and run. But there are no useful economical use cases as of yet. So you have high cost to build, and it's hard to sell quantum computers without economical use cases. And at the moment there are maybe between 3 and 30 logical qubits, depending on the definition of logical. But you need 1,000 to 2,000 logical qubits to have meaningful use cases. So in the early phase, it's very helpful if you're already profitable. That de-risks the investment case quite a lot.
Mm-hmm. Do you think they have a first mover advantage in this?
Yes, I do. And I also think that but they're not building the hardware themselves. So they're not a competitor to IBM or to Google, or they're really an enabler. But what Wolfgang and Magdalena, how they described it, is they said, okay, we have patents, and so nobody else can do this. Only after 15 years, when the patents are ending, then people could potentially capture this. But there are also secret ingredients to the formula, and they feel that they innovate very fast, and they learn also a lot of new things. And typically, when you have an architecture, then and when people adopt it, the winner takes all.
After this interview, which parts of the quantum stack became more interesting to you?
Now, I still like the enablers. And that could be enablers in the interconnect. That could be enablers with chip testing. That the enablers, the suppliers to the hardware companies that are building, that is the part where I'm most excited about. And what I learned is I learned a total new company that before I was not aware of.
Mm-hmm. And why do you prefer the enablers and not the guys who are really making the stuff?
At the moment, it's undecided which quantum computer or computing technology will win. So there are 7 competing technologies, and within each technology, there are multiple companies competing. So and everything I hear is that it's very difficult to pick the winning technology. And even within the winning technology, it's not clear which company will win. So the technology risk at this stage in time is, in my point of view, very high. And it's much lower, the technology risk is much lower in enabling companies. And the economics, the monetization phase is earlier.
Oh, okay. I understand that. Does this interview reinforce your idea that quantum may look more like the semiconductor than the software industry, or the other way around?
Good question. I don't really know. I think it's more like the semiconductor industry.
Well, looking at the semiconductor industry or the technology industry more broadly, what are the quantum equivalents of the likes of ARM, Cadence, Synopsys, or an ASML?
The equivalent of ARM could be companies like ParityQC. A Cadence, it could be, I recently interviewed Kotar and QC Design. And for chip testing like ASML, there's, for example, Orange Quantum Computing. That could be companies that could be alternatives.
Okay. If you had to name 3 investment implications from the ParityQC interview, what would they be? Something about hardware, of architecture, or commercial traction?
Now, what I was surprised of is I feel that this is really bringing forward quantum technology, and there's so much that I don't know. Before this interview, I was really not aware of the architecture of Parity, and it really improves and brings forward the technology, and there are a lot of smart things that people can do. If money and time is allocated and smart talent is allocated to it. And I have the feeling that things are really accelerating. So more talent and more capital is being is flowing into this space. And I feel that it really accelerates the move to fault tolerant quantum computing. And I think the interview with Parity is really a good example of that.
Okay, so to track this technology development, what would be the most important KPIs to track for Parity?
Now, for Parity, what's very important is that the hardware developers adopt it. So a good KPI would be, Wolfgang said, the best KPI would be how many hardware developers are adopting the technology. And that will also be licensing. How many companies are licensing that technology?
Mm-hmm. And adoption and licensing, would that also be an indication for how well they are developing their technology, or are you also looking at, for example, press releases or other data on their advances in developing their model?
Now, what is also interesting is 1 or 2 years ago they said, okay, we can do 25 qubits on the quantum Fourier benchmark, and now they're at 52. I'm keen to see how that progresses. So that's also one thing I will track, and which they will publish, and yeah.
Yes. What would increase your conviction in Parity success over the next 2 or 3 years? What would you look for?
Now, I think what is interesting is access to capital. So if they are able to raise additional capital, then it's more credible that they remain a neutral player. So they can really become a neutral host. And the other thing that Wolfgang and Magdalena said is, okay, we have the parity relationships, but the next step is we want to apply error correction towards their approach. And at some point, we need logical qubits. And we need 1,000 to 2,000 logical qubits. And yeah, I'm keen to see how they can contribute to that. So if they can show more progress on that, then my conviction would go up on parity. But also if there are important announcements of licensing and hardware developers using their architecture, that would be very important.
Now you mentioned the possibilities for them and the positive sides, but do you also see risks?
And the biggest risk for parity is that the technology is not getting adopted. So that hardware developers say, no, we don't need your technology. We go for our own approach. But the drawback of that is that with the 2 qubit, the approach of parity is reducing the amount of swap gates required. And it leads to better connectivity. And also if you know, for example, if you know the distance between Amsterdam and Vienna, and Amsterdam and London, and Amsterdam and Berlin, if there is an error in one of those, you can also calculate the distance between other cities. And with that, you can also have better error-corrected qubits.
Mm-hmm. Probably one of the risks you mentioned is that hardware companies adopt them. Is there an advantage for hardware companies to take their own internal architecture, or what is the risk of them adopting an external architecture like parity?
Now, there's additional cost for hardware builders, and part of the value will go to the architecture player, ParityQC. But there is, what I really track is the competitive environment and the competitive intensity. So if in superconducting, IBM, if they would use parity, and Google is not using ParityQC architecture, and the architecture gives a strategic benefit, then it forces Google also to adopt it. Or they have to accept that they have a structural disadvantage.
Mhm. Is there a risk that someone buys them?
Yes, I think it's a credible risk. They prefer to be neutral, but I think there is a risk if the strategic advantage is real. If I were a quantum computing builder, I would try to get my hands on it.
Mhm. But that risk decreases probably if they get more customers.
More customers and more capital. Yeah.
Uh-huh. It's a European company, so you said if they need more capital, would it also be a risk that instead of being a European company, they are being bought or funded by Americans, and as Europe we lose another promising company?
Yes, that's a real risk. The access to capital in the US is much better. So that's a fair risk.
What does their story tell you about the broader quantum market? Have your opinion on that changed?
No, it's slightly improved because during the interview I learned that they can bring forward the quantum computing with their architecture. How big that advantage is, that remains to be seen. At the moment it's one application, and they have to demonstrate it with multiple applications and multiple algorithms. But the quantum Fourier transform benchmark is a very well recognized benchmark, so that's quite promising.
Well, I think we've come to an end this interview. Thank you for explaining about ParityQC. For me, it would be really nice if we, over time, would have a new European champion in this new technology area and regain some competitiveness. Perhaps it could be the next ASML for Europe.
Or the next ARM.
Or the next ARM.
Henny, thank you a lot for interviewing. It was a great pleasure. And thank you for hosting.
Well, you're welcome.